Boudreau.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. I think you're really making the point that there's an important value in scaling the application of existing technologies, not betting on one horse, but scaling the application of promising technologies in order to advance the research around risk identification and risk mitigation, and then the effectiveness, obviously, of these technologies. So I'd like really to focus in on that if we could, because you've made the case that in order to mitigate the damage that climate change is doing to our oceans, we need to do this. But in order to start to get ahead on emissions, and in terms of removing emissions from the atmosphere, we need to do this. So it seems like the critical element is we need to scale the most promising technologies and monitor them very carefully. And it certainly seems like Atlantic Canada has a lead in that. So just speak to why, just focus in on, if you could each provide an example, and we've had a few, but really digging into how it's essential that we be scaling the technologies in parallel with the research in order to benefit both groups and the ecology and our environment. So maybe if I could start with you, Dr. Halfyard, and move through each of you. I'd really appreciate some examples that really sort of bring it to life. And again, 2-syllable words wherever you can. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Deacon. A wonderful question in a wonderful context. It is essential that we both scale those technologies where we feel it is safe to do so, and where the technology is proven out enough that we can move forward in a controlled growth way, while we continue to explore all opportunities. If we think of this in a portfolio context, you don't always know where you're going to have the biggest yield on your investment. And in that framing, there may be emerging technologies that we're not fully aware of, and certainly for which we do not have adequate information to scale yet. But there are those where we do. And I would point to our river alkalinity enhancement as one where we can move that forward. And I think the industry is aligned with us in that regard, that they're comfortable as we move this forward. But that is still a relatively small movement. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities to pair at scale research, which is an important missing component as we see academic colleagues working with industry, and that offers the ability to come outside of a controlled laboratory or mesocosm setting and apply in real world applications where we can put out meaningful amounts of materials or apply projects at a meaningful scale while having that background of controlled research to support the initiative. So we can do both, and they don't always have to be at odds. They can be done in parallel. And there's just a little bit of glue that often is needed to bring that together. And again, that's why Canada's in a leadership role here, where we have the expertise. We have some of the best universities in the world, some of the best natural resources. And in context of us, we work with some very strong groups that are representing outdoor enthusiasts, environmentalists, but also industrial players who have a huge amount of expertise in moving large amounts of material, huge amount of expertise on how technology can be integrated into developing economies. And doing so, I look at the ocean tech sector here in Halifax. That is going to be a huge advantage for those of us working in climate in and around water. So it is essential. I don't think there's much arguing there. It's just what that looks like and how there can be leadership to push us in the right direction. Thank you.
Next person who would like to jump in on this, please.
I guess I could say one.
Should I go next? I don't know. Is there an order?
Actually, Dr. Algar just started to speak, and then you can have your next say, Senator Buchwald. Thank you, or Dr.
Sure.
Buchwald.
Sure, thanks. And I was just speaking because I wasn't sure I was going to jump in next. But I guess when we're thinking of scaling up, and we're thinking particularly of the environmental impacts, one thing to consider is there's two sort of maybe scales of impacts. There's local impacts at the addition source where there might be bigger perturbations in ocean conditions, because ultimately, if you think of particularly with the type of alkalinity enhancement we're doing in Halifax Harbor, when it comes in as a point source. So there's going to be a big perturbation there, and you could have impacts from that. And then there's the longer impacts on the fact that we're modifying an elemental cycle on the global scale, the carbon cycle, which we're doing anyway, as I mentioned. But there might be impacts that maybe will emerge over, like, an impact that might be tolerable because there's a small amount, might mean more once we start doing things at scale. And I think that's one reason why we need the research. As we ramp up scales, we do the research at the same time, so we know what's going on, so that we'll sort of have to assess these impacts and whether or not they're tolerable in real time. So that's what I think. And also to point out that when we are scaling up, academic researchers couldn't do this on our own. As was just mentioned, we don't, we wouldn't be able to conduct this project even on the scale that Planetary is doing in Halifax Harbor because of the heavy equipment, just the scale of what's involved. So industry, there does have to be this partnership with industry to pull off the at scale pieces.
Thank you. Dr. Buchwald.
So for the question is, why is it essential to scale the technologies in parallel with the research? And I think from my perspective, some of the uncertainties with these methods are how much carbon is actually going to be sequestered, because the ultimate goal is that we're sequestering this carbon and we're going to be helping that global scale carbon cycle, as Chris mentioned, and that CO2 is removed. Well, the ocean, as we know, is a very complicated system. And even as oceanographers, we understand parts of it, but there's still so much we don't understand in terms of how the ocean regulates CO2 in general. And so I think one of the uncertainties with these methods is that if we scale them up, is the ocean going to do what we expect it to do, or is there going to be other things that happen that change the amount of CO2 that is actually sequestered? So this is as we do it, the ocean kind of changing, and I think, but we can't really like that. Those things in models are very hard to predict. The uncertainties are very large. And so I think the only way that we're going to determine how much we are actually removing more carbon is if we're researching it as we're doing, because as we're doing those scale up. So I think, almost the answer to your question is yes, we need to be kind of doing them at the same time, because I don't think that our level of knowledge of how the ocean's going to respond to this change. It's the same thing with climate change. Like, as the climate has been changing, we're constantly as oceanographers learning new things as it's warming. And we had models 10, 20 years ago that said this was going to happen in the ocean. And now we're at that point, we're seeing, okay, is that what we said was going to happen is going to happen? And a lot of times it's not always the case. So I think this is one of those cases where, because it needs to be a large solution and we can't, with the knowledge we have, necessarily predict what's going to happen, is we have to be kind of scaling the technology with the research at the same time so that we can keep going back and forth on what's going to be happening. I do think, though, the promise in some of these methods is that the risks, the environmental risks seem kind of low. Like, I think the risks of it maybe taking up more CO2 as we expect it to. Sometimes maybe that uncertainty could be larger, but growing more seaweed in the ocean is likely not going to hurt things, or adding more alkalinity that's already being deposited through rivers is likely not going to, it's going to, as we can see in rivers, it actually helps things. So a lot of these solutions, it feels like some of the risks in that sense are maybe lower, but we really do need to keep researching to make sure that they're actually going to take up the CO2 we expect them to, we expect them to do. And we can really not predict that until we have these scaled, exercises to keep studying it. Thanks.
Dr. Halfyard, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Or Dr. Koweek, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the question. I'd actually like to start by challenging a little bit the idea that the scale up and the research are different. And let me explain. When we talk about the need for carbon dioxide removal as a critical part of the climate solutions portfolio alongside emissions reduction, we often talk as scientists about the need to do carbon dioxide removal at the scale of gigatons per year. That's billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal. It's really hard to picture that because carbon dioxide is a gas in our atmosphere. We can't see it. But actually, it turns out that there's only a few industries on the planet that move billions of tons of material around each year. And they're the big, heavy industries, the things that you would think of like oil and gas and cement and a few other big commodities. And so when we think about trying to figure out what works and what are which carbon dioxide removal techniques work, which marine carbon dioxide removal techniques work, and what are their environmental and social co-benefits and risks, we have to be doing that in the context of scaled up research, development, and demonstration. And that's why I keep saying demonstration, because we have to be thinking about this and learning from the process of doing these scaled testing. And that scaled testing starts to draw on a wider group of sectors and experts that are needed to evaluate it. So people with economics experience and business experience, people with governance experience and regulatory experience, people with experience thinking about supply chains and how to operate heavy equipment alongside the scientists and the engineers, people with experience on community engagement and social science, and the list could go on and on. And so I think we really should think I think it's really important to think about that research, development, and demonstration pipeline so that we don't keep the fundamental scientific questions so separate from all of the applied questions about scale up that are just as absolutely critical if we want to get any of these solutions to scale as part of a durable climate solutions portfolio. Thank you.